Welcome to Dorsey & Whitney's webinar on top 10 issues construction and development projects are facing in today's pandemic economy and how to avoid them. I'd like to introduce Jeffrey Escobar, a partner in Dorsey's real estate group. Jeff?
Thank you, Sean, and thank you all for attending our roundtable for today, top 10 issues that construction projects are facing in today's pandemic economy. I'm Jeff Escobar, real estate development infrastructure partner here at Dorsey & Whitney in its New York office. My practice largely focuses on real estate development, construction transactions and practices, and project finance on large commercial and utility-grade renewable energy projects, and advising real estate companies, joint ventures, institutional owners, closely held developers, lenders, investors, sponsors, project companies, public and private utility companies, and private funds across the United States and Americas, and the financing and deployment of capital and complex and large-scale construction projects. I'm joined today by my colleagues, Charles Boland and Barrett Richards at Greyhawk North America, an award-winning and highly regarded construction management and consultant firm who have successfully managed everything from the construction of the American Airlines Arena in Miami, Florida, to the Pennsylvania Turnpike in Barclays Stadium. In the last 25 years, Charlie and Barrett have managed more than $10 billion worth of troubled construction projects and have led the construction of over $3 billion in construction assets. Thank you, Charlie and Barrett, for joining me today. And Charlie and Barrett, if you don't mind giving a short introduction of yourselves.
Thanks, Jeff. Since I'm the older one, I'll start first. I'm Charlie Boland. I've been in the construction industry for over 40 years and doing a smattering of design and construction, but for the bulk of my career, it's been dealing with troubled projects and resolving claims and disputes in production and in construction. So I've been living the dark side for a lot of years, working for all stakeholders in the construction industry throughout North America primarily. And happy to be on the panel and look forward to having a nice discussion about the impacts. Barrett.
Thanks, Charlie. Jeff. My name is Barrett Richards. I'm a senior managing consultant with Greyhawk. This is actually, I'm a boomerang. So I started out my career with Greyhawk over 20 years ago. That's when I first met Charlie, and he convinced me to come back a few years ago. So here I am. I'm based out of our New York metro office, and so most of my career actually has been in this area, although I do have experience in the international construction arena. I've spent some time with some of the largest engineering firms, including Jacobs Engineering, and then also with some of the largest audit and tax firms, namely Ernst & Young and Deloitte, working with project audit teams and also consulting on large capital programs. Most of my experience is on the project control side, both on active construction projects and then also, as Charlie has mentioned, coming in from the dark side once it's all said and done and someone's got to go back and figure out what happened. So extensive experience in cost estimating and scheduling, damages and delay analysis. And I've also spent a few years as an adjunct professor at the Farmingdale University, also Pratt Institute in their construction management programs, teaching both cost estimating and CPM, critical path method scheduling. And yeah, it's been an interesting industry to be in. Not one that I anticipated getting involved in, but it's been very rewarding.
Well, and it's certainly going to be an interesting time moving forward. And I thank you both for attending and helping me out on this panel today. You know, we've worked together on quite a few number of projects and rescuing some of those. And so your insights are going to be really highly valuable. So for today's event, just a few ground rules for the presentation. Because this is really intended to be a roundtable and a panel with all of you. If you have any questions or concerns you would like to pose or discuss throughout our discussions today, please go ahead and use your chat function that you have on your Zoom account, which usually is at the bottom of your screen, and pose the question. Throughout the presentation today, we're going to be monitoring those questions that are being asked and weave our thoughts and responses throughout the discussion and throughout our responses. If for some reason we're unable to get to your question or properly answer it, know that we're going to also be following up individually and separate email our thoughts. Secondly, we're going to be asking also a number of poll questions throughout today's presentations. Now, these poll questions, because again, it's a roundtable and being interactive as possible, are really intended to provide all of us as individuals in the construction industry and stakeholders real-time data as to what not only what your company is facing, but what the industry as a whole are facing today on its projects. We have attending today's roundtable over 150 stakeholders across all swaths of the construction development industry. And so your responses to some of these poll questions will provide real-time data and will be an invaluable tool for all of us as we look forward to managing our future projects. And lastly, we're going to be covering about 10 topics today. We're just going to be touching the tip of the iceberg with a lot of these issues. So if there's anything that we raise, any questions that you might have, it'll be an opportunity for us to connect individually, and we encourage you all to do so. So let's begin. With the pandemic entering its 5th month, coronavirus cases and deaths surging throughout large swaths of most of the United States and throughout America, and then the uncertainty of how prolonged the pandemic outbreak will continue to be, the pandemic's impacts on our industry as a whole is now expected to last well into 2022, with some projects being forecasted to suffer related setbacks well into 2023 and beyond. What this pandemic economy really brings, multiple degrees of uncertainty to construction development projects. And there really is no exact precedent to look for how the industry might respond, recover, and move forward. As we all know, the construction industry tends to be 2 cycles behind the rest of the economy. And right now, we're only beginning to feel the tip of the effects of the pandemic. And so why Charlie Barrett and I brought this discussion together today is really intended to bring together all of us stakeholders from across the country to quickly identify what those effects are or may be in the future, steps and best practices that stakeholders can take today to successfully manage those project risks, and how we as an industry might mitigate liability or possible disputes in the future. And so in talking with a lot of you in the audience today and through our respective practices, we may be able to identify in preparation for today the following 10 issues that we're currently seeing as to what the boots on the ground are facing with current and future projects. Top 10 topics that have seemed to keep resurfacing are: number 1, impacts on project financing and securing project financing, potential relief that might be available under an existing construction contract for any delays or impacts that might be suffered, supply chain, logistics, and labor force shortages and impacts. We're talking about a little bit, but beginning to see middle market contractor and subcontractor vulnerability and bankruptcies that might lead to a default of a project. Compliance with COVID monitoring, work restrictions that are being required by local and state authorities. We're beginning to see delayed and canceled projects, or how can we delay a cancel project and avert liability. How to quantify productivity losses, which largely comes from delay claims that many stakeholders are claiming to owners and lenders for the projects. And then how do we respond to those contractor claims? The forecasting of time performance, because as we will touch upon today, more and more even on the financing side, forecasting of time performance is being required for purposes of financing successful projects. And then lastly, regulatory agency permitting inspection impacts. And so before we begin, let's just take our first poll. So how many of these are issues your organization is currently facing that we've identified as some of the top 10 projects? We'll give you all about 10 seconds or so to respond. Okay, Sean, you want to see what the audience has said? 1 to 3 seems to be the overwhelming choice, with 4 to 7, being the second runner-up. So it looks like overall, almost 75% of the respondents have been suffering at least 1 to 7 of these over these issues. Charlie Barrett, are you surprised by the results?
Not necessarily. I mean, I might have thought it would be a little on the higher side, but quite frankly, I think it's still early, and folks are not really fully realizing the impact of the COVID issues on their projects. But I think as time goes on, I think those numbers may switch a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, Jeff, to a comment you made earlier about the construction industry running a couple cycles behind. In some of the conversations I've had with contractors and others, they said, hey, what impacts, right? I hear about social distancing causing increased costs, I haven't seen anything as business as normal. So not surprising to me, it is where it is. But as Charlie said, I think as we move forward, it will start moving into those higher ranges, unfortunately, as people better understand as they identify and better understand the impacts.
Right. Well, and I think that's interesting because if we go to our first topic today, is really impacts on project financing, and unlike with the boots on the ground and the construction cycle being a couple cycles behind, the financing of some of these projects tend to be right in line with what the economy is facing, or at least closely right behind what the economy is currently facing. And so, on the construction financing side, the impacts seem to fall into 5 main buckets. The first 3 listed here. Number 1, borrowers seeking relief from debt obligations due to a shortfall or delay in revenue. Lenders and investors inquiring whether or not events on site construction can constitute an event of default under financing documents. This includes contractor suspensions or abandonment of the works, the failure to achieve relevant milestones. There's financial obligations in the financing documents, whether or not any of those constitute an event of default or a material event of default. Failure to abide by notification requirements triggered by pandemic events. Then we also have liquidity issues, which talk about further lenders enforcing cash management rules. So, with topic number 1, a lot of borrowers have begun really seeking relief from debt obligations due to shortfalls and delay in revenue. Where that's really been coming from senior assisted living facilities, by and large, at least in my practice, in which because of falling sales that have been either forestalled because of projects, developing projects having to put hold on their projects, or questions of whether or not existing or upcoming projects really properly address pandemic health concerns. There has been a deep fall from the sales of some of these facilities and developments, and so a lot of borrowers now are kind of coming short because of this downplay or decline in delay in revenue. They've coming to lenders to seek if there's any type of relief that can be obtained, and oftentimes not, it's become kind of become cumbersome row. I mean, I think that lenders at the beginning have been more willing to do so, but now the belt is tightening on all markets.
Jeff, one thing that kind of jumps out at me on this slide is the point of cost overruns.
Yeah.
And as I think about that, it's very important to understand where the areas of potential cost overruns are, and for stakeholders to work together to identify them and then forecast out what the potential impact is on the project. In my mind, that makes the securing of project finance that much easier and more, I guess, a more collaborative effort, as opposed to just trying to hide your head in the sand, so to speak. The cost overruns don't happen, because my experience is with different types of projects, there are different areas where these cost overruns do come up time and time again. So I think identifying them and working together to forecast the potential impacts of those cost overruns is key.
Well, it's interesting that you've said that, because what we've been seeing is within the LIHTC and senior living markets and their equity investors, that having and dealing or being able to both forecast, but also having enough cash reserves and having it and really being able to cushion a project to deal with these differing pandemic-related delays and cost overruns and suspensions of work has been a major criterion for both projects that have already been approved and the commitments are in place, to those that are coming online and wishing to get financing. And in fact, what we're seeing more and more now are projects that if there isn't any type of thought process that's put into place, and if there isn't any type of cushioning that's in financing that's been into place by the developer to help mitigate these risks, lenders and investors, especially within the LHTC market and the senior living market, have really backed away from, even if projects have already been passed credit. And so, if there's one takeaway when you're talking about relief and obligations, understanding your shortfalls and delays, is really kind of taking a long view and looking at the worst case scenario, and only those projects that really contemplate how they're going to fund the worst case scenario, the one and also avoid delays, are the ones that are getting approved for financing more so than others. And on that point, I mean, I think it's an addition. It's interesting is that although that equity market is beginning to stabilize, it's anticipating, and their prices are anticipating for financing to decrease or remain steady. Only those projects that face or are able to pass this huge scrutiny are able to get the financing that's required. And so, to the extent we're at the beginning of all this, I think it's behoove a lot of, whether you be on the contractor side or the developer side, is really understanding the financing behind it, and how do you pay for the inevitable delays and cost overruns that are coming across the projects in this COVID era. And then along the same lines, again, talking about looking to financing documents, there's been a lot of questions that have been raised as to whether or not failures to achieve milestones, and if you're defaulting or suspending a contractor, does that constitute an event of default? Which more oftentimes than not, from an attorney's viewpoint, they're trying to wrangle us to make that argument for them on behalf of the lenders.
I think it's going to be incumbent upon the lenders to scrutinize projects a little further and a little more actively, and making sure that on a more regular basis, progress is being achieved, because there will be productivity losses due to COVID. And if you wait for the normal cycle to identify them, you may be behind the curve.
Exactly. And along the same lines, what's been interesting is that dealing with financing also in hand of that is liquidity issues, and contractors now being much more forceful about verifying the financial the financing of a project. Prior to this pandemic, it was pretty normal for all of us to strike off or from a construction contractor severely restrict contractor or construction manager's ability to look into the financing of a project. The expectation really now, and what's really become more so, and we've been mending a lot of agreements along these same lines, is really not only the contractor being able to show that they're viable and be able to finish a project, but the contractor at any point in time should be able to ask, or is looking to ask, owners for the ability to review the financing for a project and confirm that they're in place. We're of course pushing back from the owner and developer side. A lot of those requests are really kind of making it very limited, but it's interesting the volume and number of requests to amend even existing contracts to provide for that has increased steadily. So it's very much on the minds of all new transactions being entered into. And then the last issue, with respect to project financing, has really been cash management rules. Under a lot of financing documents, if there is even a whisper of an event of default or possible default or delay on a project, it used to be that banks and lenders would be reticent to trigger cash management rules and be really involved in not only in the outlay of the cash, but also on how the cash is being used and whatnot. But now more and more we've been seeing cash management rules being triggered by lenders as much as possible, even a minor delay constituting a default that would require these reviews. And so again, thinking ahead of what we're facing, that also interplays into the future of construction projects as well, and how fluid they can be and how quickly they can move forward. So hand in hand with financing, of course, is the ability to seek relief under available under any existing construction contracts. And what we've been seeing on our side is a lot of questions relating to interpreting existing contract language. I hope that we're all on the same page now, but force majeure, I think, was first raised at the beginning as being a possible relief. But correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I mean, force majeure is just not a viable option. Notwithstanding the fact that disease has never been treated as a force majeure event, but even the uniqueness, I think we're well past that foreseeability period where you could really rely on a force majeure to try to get to your obligations or seek some sort of relief for your obligations. And then, there's also been a lot of issues with respect to contract language and whether or not, parties are meeting time limits for notification of claims. And if you're seeking a request for a delay, compliance with the requirements. More oftentimes than not, a lot of stakeholders have been boxed out of being able to use a construction contract to be able to seek some sort of relief due to a COVID-related delay, only because they failed to have followed to the letter, what the notification of claim requirements are under agreements. So, it'd be interesting to see what you guys have seen as well, if that's been pushed a lot and if people have been really kind of asking you all to take a closer look at some of these claims and whether or not they are able to raise them under their construction contracts.
Yeah, well, we've had some discussions with some of our contractor clients about the response to the COVID impacts, and the first push was to go force majeure, as you mentioned, but that's time, no money, so that's not going to help. Because we're really talking about some serious cost impacts here. And then it's really just making sure there's an awareness of all of the issues that are out there that are being caused by the pandemic, and looking eyes wide open at them, because you don't want to have an impact to a project that's COVID related, folded over and disguised by another impact that you won't be getting relief for. So it's a matter of taking additional steps to identify areas of impact and raising the flag as soon as you get an indication that there's an impact. Right.
Well, what's interesting, and along the same points, moving to item number 2, what I had been approached by is in respect to kind of negotiating how delay of performance is to be treated is, one of the larger CMs in the city actually posed a COVID qualification as to how delays in performance is to be treated. And, basically, and I apologize that I'm reading it, but the provision they've requested and pushed hard for, which is kind of controversial, states that they wanted this provision to read, because the scope and severity of the coronavirus is currently unknown, the scope and the magnitude of the potential costs and delays arising from any such virus-related impacts are not possible to determine at the time. As a result, all such costs and time impacts arising from the coronavirus are excluded from the work and project schedule. To the extent that the project is impacted from any such COVID impacts, contract price and project schedule shall be adjusted accordingly. And oh, by the way, the owner's acceptance of this qualification is a condition precedent of the validity of this agreement. Which, when that was first posed to me, at least, it seemed outrageous. Of course, kind of pounded the phone down. But then come to know that, this is a very large construction manager in the city. They were able to get 2 public authorities to already agree to this, to this provision. So, I'm just wondering, it's interesting because to me, things like this nature, deletion of time of essence terms throughout the contract, it seems like that's been a ploy that a lot of contractors have been trying to use in trying to, negotiate how to deal with delay in performance in their construction contracts. And then what we've also been seeing a lot of is indemnification requests, which contractors are asking to be indemnified. They'll indemnify the owner, of course, but if it's COVID-related delays or anything, or COVID-related third-party claims, they're asking the owner to indemnify them, the contractor, from that, and also capping liability and trying to get out of the contract, which has been largely difficult to do because termination rights are just not largely available to a contractor. And frustration on the project, I don't think that anybody can really claim those. That's been a frustration on the project as of yet. And so, in asking this question and moving to our next poll, do you agree or disagree with that the following COVID pandemic qualification that I just read should be included in your construction contract? And before we get to the poll, Barrett, Charlie, what do you guys think?
Well, I think there's been a flurry of activity around this to have counsel, legal counsel, stepping in to advocate for their clients, and there's a lot of activity here, and I only see it continuing. Right now, it's a band-aid on existing contracts, but going forward, there's going to be a lot more language installed in contracts, and this is just the beginning.
Yeah, we've already seen with some of the major organizations that are out there that represent industry, they're already pushing for these kind of provisions to be included in contracts. So it's only going to, I think, just exponentially be out there. in my mind, this is a perfect example where it's important for both sides, whether, from the contractor's perspective, the owner's perspective, they get together and try to find a happy medium.
Right.
As Charlie said, they're going to be, pushing for their side's interests, which, you can't blame anybody for doing that. But in the end, where's that going to leave a project, right?
Right.
It's better to try to have those communication lines open and really, acknowledge that, hey, everyone's impacted by this and there isn't one party that's responsible for it. So how are we going to best share the burden of the associated costs and time?
Well, and I think, to a certain extent, and maybe what a solution can be, would be really to seek and try to build in some sort of sunset of these COVID qualification provisions. Because, at the end of the day, I think any owner, developer, project, or a lender, at the outset, having one of these contracts exist for, eternity in their contracts is one thing that probably isn't approachable, but really kind of pushing through negotiating a sunset to when this is applicable might be the way to go, quite frankly, just because, again, it gives a little bit of a modicum of comfort to the owner, developers, and lenders to say, okay, we'll live with this, but we're going to have to live with this for a short period of time with our project.
I think we had an attendee chime in here and say that they're a national GC and they're using very similar language in their contract with owners. So there's a bit of validation for you, Jeff.
Well, so that's interesting. So having said that, we'll launch our next poll, and the next poll being, do you agree or disagree to everyone in the audience that the provision that we just read and talking about today, as qualification delay should be included in your construction contract? Give everybody a little bit of time. Okay, so let's take a look and see what our audience thinks. 73% to 28%. Interesting. It's funny. I think that it's a lot higher than I would have predicted it to be, quite frankly. Maybe I'll have to relook at my negotiation tactics with some of these divisions, but that's good. I mean, I think what it signals to all of us is that the industry is willing, and I think that for anyone who's negotiating these provisions, understand that the industry does have, quite frankly, a little bit of ability or comfort to be able to enter into these type of provisions, provide that we all do so smartly and in everybody's balanced interests rather than just one side versus the other. Great, thanks. And so we're going to move on to the third topic that we've raised and identified, and that's the supply chain impact, site logistics, and labor force shortages.
Yeah, so Jeff, on this one, there are a couple things from this slide that I think sometimes get overlooked. One is the fact that these supply chain impacts often are experienced before they hit the field, so to speak, right? You have maybe a window that's specified for a project, and you really got to look upstream in terms of, all right, what are the potential impacts in terms of manufacturing, fabrication, delivery. Charlie and I actually have a client who we were talking with a few months back about a project they have here in the Metro New York area, and part of their contract involves moving materials from the Midwest. And so we just asked for us, it was a very common sense question. Well, have you thought about being able to get that material from the Midwest to New York Metro and what potential impacts are there? The answer was kind of like, well, why would I do that? We don't have anything going on here related to the pandemic that's impacting us. So it's important to look at, especially in these multi-geographical situations, look at both the upstream and the downstream. So that's one thing that needs to be carefully considered in terms of, it's not just what's happening in the field, it's what's happening upstream as well.
And Barry, on that topic, historically, it's always been, when you're looking at procurement, it's long lead items. What are your long lead items? And you're going to go out and shine a bright light on those long lead items because they're the ones that could potentially hurt you. Well, that list of long lead items has just gotten longer or greater, if you will. there's more supply chain items, there's more equipment, there's more materials that you need to look further ahead for to make sure that you're not going to have an impact.
Right. Mm-hmm. Well, and I was going to ask you both, what was interesting is at the beginning of the pandemic, and as we in the United States are trying to figure out what is going on and the rest of the world having already kind of well into the pandemic, the supply chain impacts seem to have been more of our projects being impacted by overseas slowdown. I'm just wondering if that's reversed in the sense that, a lot of the projects overseas, or a lot of jurisdictions overseas that seem to have found a way to control their pandemic, or at least move forward and found a system. If the reverse is now happening, that we, as we provide supplies, have now slowed down, or even if the supplies are coming internally, if that's slowed down rather than how it was at the beginning or the outset of the pandemic.
Well, we had a client in Pennsylvania who was able to get started pretty quickly after the shutdown, but they had issues with procuring cabinetry, which was sourced out of China, and China was still shut down. They obviously since opened up again, but they had to re-procure because they couldn't get the cabinetry they had ordered. Right.
Yeah, the other one, if you go to the next slide, Jeff.
Sure.
In terms of labor, this is one that needs to be under a constant focus for sure, especially as projects that have kind of slowed down a bit start picking up speed, and those that have stopped start resuming, because there's a backlog. And you have a crunch of projects. We're seeing a crunch of projects, and there's a limited labor force that's available. And this was an issue that existed before the pandemic in terms of being able to get skilled labor. Now it's only exacerbated because of this crunch of projects. So that's a definite impact related to the pandemic, in terms of getting the right labor and at the right time as well, as all these projects come back online.
So have you both been seeing less and less, or I guess a downward pressure on being able to assemble skilled labor for some of these projects, and being able to properly staff or being able to man these projects? And having said that, I just wonder who's been eating those costs right now, or has that resulted in a seeking of some sort of change order from the owner or the developer because of these impacts on labor?
Well, there's actually been a couple studies that have been done post the start of the pandemic that have shown that the overall impact on projects is in the 10 to 20% range. But based on conversations, again, that I've had with contractors, they're still getting either a grasp as to what the true impacts are, or they're just not looking for it. So I think what's happening is, as this pandemic unfolds, and as I think especially contractors get a better handle as to what their costs are, they're going to realize, whoa, we really, in particular when it comes to labor, we're experiencing some upward pressure on the labor components of our projects that they just haven't seen yet because they're just not looking for it.
Right.
And as Charlie pointed out before, they want to appease the owner or their owners. They want to just get the job done and just kind of, nose to the grindstone. But you've got to take the nose off the grindstone, take a look, step back a little bit and say, all right, let's do an assessment. Let's forecast where we are versus our baseline, or what we had anticipated, what we planned, and see where that's going to put us out down the road. And I think as contractors do that with a keener focus, they're going to realize that there are impacts there that they hadn't identified before.
Right.
And it's incumbent upon the subcontractors and contractors to be diligent in monitoring the work, so they can call out what are truly COVID impacts versus the normal impacts you have on a project. I mean,
right.
The construction project dynamic is one of change. There's always issues, there's always problems, and COVID, although it's a real impact, is not a get out of jail free card.
Right.
So you need to make sure that you're diligent in isolating those impacts that are purely COVID related from those that may have a design aspect to them, maybe a deficient or defective work issue, but you need to be able to try and separate that out, which all comes back to very diligent project record keeping, which isn't always the task that gets the most attention during a project.
Right. Well, and so, with respect to, I think what happens, we've got shortages of labor impacts, but then that ultimately leads to subcontractor and middle market contractor vulnerability. And, there have been whispers of this in the industry that those subcontractors and middle market contractors, that they're going to be suffering the most because they can't deal or aren't able financially to sustain a lot of these delays. And so, I guess my question for both of you is like, how often and how big of an impact is this right now? Or is this something that we are beginning to see and need to forecast for?
Well, I mean, this has and continues to be a bit. There's a lot of uncertainty about the viability of projects due to COVID, and subcontractors, vendors are being impacted by suspended projects, delayed starts, and there's also a reduction in current permitting, which is on a going forward basis is going to have some implications. So these concerns about project viability have caused a fair amount of anxiety among stakeholders, and those with some stronger balance sheets are going to be able to sustain themselves through this, but smaller or less stable entities are going to have some issues. And we've already seen some vendors that have not been able to complete projects. And I think we're still on the front end of this. I see a fair amount of it coming, but I think that it's critical to engage, for all stakeholders to be engaged in communicating about what's happening with various levels of stakeholders. We can't just assume that our vendors are going to be there and supplying at the rate we anticipated, or a subcontractor is going to have all the staffing they need or the capacity to do the work that was originally contracted. There needs to be open communication, and it sounds trite, but now more than any time, you need to be able to have eyes wide open, understanding what's going on, so you can see the landscape a little clearer and be able to have that item 3 there, have that backup plan. I mean, what happens if I can't get my cabinets from my vendor in China? Where's my alternate? How many do I have, and what's the price of that? There needs to be a number of extra steps taken by stakeholders to stay out in front of this, and it's going to be critical to take those steps, because those that don't take those steps are going to be having serious fights at the end to try and dig themselves out of a hole. Whereas if there's open communication early and often among the stakeholders, you're going to be able to put these things to rest, put these issues to rest, or at least mitigate the extent of the impact that is coming from them.
Right. Well, and my concern, and what I've been in, we've talked about this before, but my concern is that a lot of, with respect to subcontractor, middle market contractor volatility and vulnerability, seems to be an over reliance on saying, well, I've got the project's underwritten, I've got subguard on this, I've got bonding, and I think what this really is indicative of, and if these rates continue to increase, is having that viability of the underwriting not be available, or much like how on the financing side, to be able to get that underwriting, it's going to require a lot more than just creating an OSIP or a CSIP program where you're protecting against subcontractor losses. Which brings us, I guess, to our next poll. If Sean doesn't mind popping that up. And the question that we have, because it's unclear to us right now where the market lies, is have you had to replace a subcontractor or vendor on a project due to COVID? Give everybody a few seconds to respond. Okay, let's take a look and see what the panel say, or the audience says. 83% have not had to do so yet. So I do think that our readings are all correct, but the analysts and the experts have come out as seeing this as a potential issue, so it's something to keep our eyes on. All right, and then moving to the next topic, compliance with COVID monitoring and work restrictions.
Okay. Well, this is a new dynamic in the construction industry that needs to be dealt with. I mean, we're back to work for the most part, but we're back to work with some restrictions and issues. And about the monitoring compliance with requirements, what requirements? Those requirements, as we experience in the ebb and flow of daily life, they're changing a bit. They're morphing. They're being refined, and we need to stay on top of them. And they're going to cause some inefficiency and slowdowns with a construction project, because you're stopping folks from getting onto a site because you're taking their temperature, or you're having extra cleaning work being done, and you're working in separate areas, or workforce being separated. So you're having to deal with all these things, and they're changing a bit. So it's going to add another layer of complexity and management. It has added another layer of complexity and management, and it's incumbent upon the stakeholders to try and mitigate and minimize the impact of that. I mean, it's a reality. In order for us to move forward, we have to be able to address this, and you can do it as efficiently as possible. I mean, there's technology out there for thermal temperature scanning, where you can monitor folks on a bulk basis and do by exception secondary screening if necessary. So there's ways to be as efficient as possible, but it's going to have an impact on project productivity, as shown here on slide 4. I mean, you got testing at arrival, testing during the day. You're going to have potentially increased shifts and work hours to deal with the loss of productivity based on the reduction in workforce with smaller crews. You're going to have increased supervision because of the additional shift, et cetera. And these are all going to have time and cost impacts that are going to need to be dealt with. And we'll talk about the quantification of those on a future slide.
Right.
I think a key consideration here, as Charlie has touched on, is the duty to mitigate that's included in most contracts. So if someone's going in a situation like this thinking, oh, I got all these COVID costs, I'm going to recover every single cent and dollar associated with it, without giving a good faith effort in terms of, all right, what can I do differently to work more efficiently given these monitoring requirements and the restrictions, that's going to be something that's going to be taken into consideration when, an owner, we would advise an owner to look for that. Hey, did your contractor try to do something that would improve the situation or not? Right. And if you're trying to put forward, a classic total cost claim, say, hey, here's what I bid, here's what the difference is. And this kind of gets back to what is something Charlie touched on earlier, and we'll probably touch on a little bit later. And that is not segregating out the COVID-19 impacts from others and thinking, the difference has got to be COVID-19. That's not going to go very far.
Right.
Yeah. And just adding to that, the impacts to quantify. I mean, there's numerous. We've made lists that are dozens of topics long, but just getting to the work site, site flow restrictions, vertical transportation for high-rise construction. You can't just jump on it. You can't just have elbow to elbow on a hoist going up anymore. So getting to your work area is going to be impacted, and you may have sick or infected workers that are now going to be quarantined and not able to come to the site. So there's a long list of impacts that need to be identified and recognized on your project.
Right. Well, and this kind of brings an interesting point, and I'm going to raise this point in the next poll question. But given all of this, who's going to be responsible? Who should be responsible for implementing and bearing the costs of this increased monitoring and compliance requirements? Is it contractor for both, the owner for both, the contractor for implementing, but the owner is going to bear the additional increased cost, or the reverse, where the owner is going to set forth, the compliance and the monitoring requirements, but the contractor is going to, have to carry the costs for that program. So, I invite everyone to vote right now and what you think, and let's take a look and see what the industry is thinking.
There you go.
So it seems to be, and I think it's a more reasonable view, is that the contractor is going to implement, but the owner is going to bear the additional cost. I would argue that it depends on what the additional cost is going to be, but that's it's an interesting viewpoint in a sense. I've had it where kind of obstinate owners have asked and pushed that the contractor be responsible for both. But I think that has a lot to do with more existing contracts and existing projects than those moving forward.
Yeah, and I think that it's going to be a shared responsibility, obviously, going forward. It's incumbent upon all stakeholders to minimize, but at the end of the day, any way you go, the owner's going to pay. If the contractor's fronting the cost for that, guess what? Contractor's cost ultimately is going to be higher. So the owner will end up paying, but I think it's incumbent upon everyone to understand it's there and make best efforts to mitigate the impact of it.
So delayed or canceled projects. I think this is interesting because the American Road and Transportation Builders Association just reported that there's a record $9.6 billion worth of projects that have just been delayed or canceled across across 44 states due to the pandemic. And so I'm interested in seeing what you guys are seeing out there in the marketplace right now as well.
Yeah, so go ahead, Charlie.
Well, we're seeing some rumblings about the major projects that may be having the brakes put on, and it really is a mixed bag. But I think it's a reality that once stakeholders take a close look at what's happening, there's going to be some hard decisions that are going to be made, and they're going to need facts to make those decisions. And I think it's important to be able to give a clear picture of what the COVID impact to a project will be, both time and cost. And then from there, owners and developers can make a valid decision or make an informed decision as to whether or not, it makes sense, whether it fits the pro forma to move forward in this environment, or whether they should be delaying the project for a period of time. But it's going to take input from all stakeholders.
Yeah, and in regards to these types of projects, whether they're delayed or mothballed, right, or canceled, there's still going to be either ongoing costs or costs for canceling a project. So in the case of mothballing a project or suspending the work, it's important to understand that from the owner's perspective, it doesn't mean that you're going to be able to put the checkbook down, so to speak. There are costs that are inherent to keeping a project viable for that date when you're able to resume the work. So understanding that there's certain maintenance costs, whether it be site security or certain infrastructure or utility services that need to be maintained, it's important to understand that and understand that those costs are going to continue until such time as the work can resume. So just because a project's been suspended doesn't mean that the costs are going to stop entirely. There's got to be a recognition that those costs are going to continue to some degree. And then when it comes to the canceled projects, I think some of the important points here to remember is that you've got to get the work to a certain point where you can actually safely shut down a project, right? So completing the essential elements of work and then documenting where the project's at. And this applies both to the mothballed or the suspended situation, or also with the canceled project situation. Drawing a line in the sand as to where the project was when the project was suspended or when it was canceled, so that when it comes to reckoning time, right, to figure out, all right, what are the additional costs here, and going for whether it be an insurance coverage or from a contractor's perspective, understanding and being able to quantify what the impacts were to you because of a suspended or a canceled project. It's important to have that baseline to measure against. In terms of seeking that relief for damages and impacts to your operations.
Well, and I think one thing that is not baked into here, and I apologize to be the lawyer on this, but really looking at your underlying construction agreements down the line, top to bottom, the viability and the transactional delays that you would face if you delay or cancel a project. At the end of the day, those are the provisions that are highly negotiated what happens if a project's been mothballed or suspended or canceled. And I do think that the impact, both liability and financially, that arises from your construction contracts and your design contracts, if you choose to delay or cancel project, needs to be taken into consideration. Because if you weren't keeping your eye on the ball at the time of your negotiations, you might be owing a lot more to the contractor, for example, for delaying or canceling a project than you would if you just kind of slowed the project down and worked with the schedule. And so along those same lines, those are next polls, how many projects your organization has been delayed or canceled or facing delay or cancellation since, I guess, March, since the pandemic began in the last 5 months. So let everybody respond, either 0, less than 10, 10 to 40, 40 to 80, or 80%, or greater than 80%. And it looks like a majority of it has been about 10%, with, interestingly enough, more than I was expecting of 10 to 40%. Again, because being at the beginning of this pandemic and really just being kind of a discussion of what we should be prepared for in the next cycle downturn, I'd expected far less. I expected more to be along the lines of less than 10%, but the fact that there's been 10 to 40 and even a 40, 80% of their projects kind of.
Well, I think we're in a position now where it's, I think we're in that shock and awe setting. Like when the recession hit, nothing happened. I mean, people just stopped because they didn't know what was going to happen. And I think that there's a bit of that now where it's the unknown is really scaring some folks. And I think that the more we shed light on it and start working through it, the more we can manage that risk and move forward. But yeah, I'm not all that surprised here.
Yeah. All right, and so we're gonna move to the next slide. Quantifying productivity losses.
Okay, well, we've talked a lot about the impact of COVID to the productivity on projects, and that what we're talking about here is just making the claim for a productivity loss. I mean, it's really straightforward. Number one is you understand your contract. What's the best clause to implement when you're trying to seek relief for this? And we've talked about force majeure versus a changes clause. I mean, but you can definitely review your contract, speak with counsel, position yourself with the most appropriate clause, and then from there, you need to timely identify the impacts, and by that, know what they are. And the next step would be, okay, give notice of them, but you can't give notice unless you are scrutinizing your project to the degree that you can identify them. And as always on any issue with change, there's a duty to mitigate the impact from these issues. And you need to take steps to make sure you're doing that. And what typically falls down in most of these claim or change request situations is documentation. It is critical to have real-time documentation that says, lost time getting to work location due to COVID. It's so many people, so much time. I mean, if you don't get that real-time data, you have to end up estimating it after the fact. And that's actual data is always a lot more persuasive than an estimate of loss of productivity. And then most importantly also is connecting these impacts to damages. Okay, big deal. What did it cost you? So it's really, and that goes along with documentation. You need good, solid records to be able to do this. And don't let up just because you made a notification of an impact. Keep tracking the costs. And I think most importantly of any of the components of the quantification exercise here is differentiate between a COVID impact and other impacts on the project. We all know that, I mentioned earlier, there's tons of impacts and problems and changes on projects. And you need to be able to definitively carve out, to the greatest extent possible, COVID impacts from every other impact you have on a project. Otherwise, you're going to be in for a fight, and you can keep yourself from getting into that fight. So I think we have a couple more points on the next slide. So yeah, the recognition is there. Labor productivity is going to change, and it's a matter of trying to track a little closer what your inputs are and what your outputs are. How much labor are you putting onto the wire pulling exercise, and how much wire are you pulling? You need to start tracking those with a little more detail in order to be able to demonstrate that I only got this much productivity today, but pre-COVID, I was able to get so much. And you can do that through a measured mile approach, and really have a strong argument for getting relief. And then again, back to mitigation, be as efficient as you can with your labor productivity. See what exercises you can do, what changes you can make in your means and methods that might be able to mitigate. And there has to be communication. Communication has been a common thread throughout this entire presentation. Too many times you see stakeholders go into their corners and say, we'll fight about this at the end. And now more than ever, that's not a good prescription for success. I mean, we need to engage each other. It's the elephant in the room. It's not like anyone's going to dispute that the elephant's there. It's just what's the extent of impact on the project. And I think if everyone works cooperatively on this, you're going to be able to come to some reasonable common ground. And then, what are the impacts to quantify? We've talked about a lot of those. We put a handful of them here. But if we put all the impacts that need to be quantified, the list would be pages long. But the key is to objectively look at your project, not in the weeds, can't see anything, but look from the 20,000 foot level and be diligent about identifying, where the impacts are.
Okay, great. And so, we're running a little close to time, and just so everybody understands, we might run just a couple minutes over, but we're just going to push through a little bit of some of these other slides that's left, and kind of skip this next poll that we had. So Sean, if we can skip that one. We've included, and again, with the impacts, now you've got the productivity impacts, but then how do you respond to the contractor's claim? I've included here some of the information, and you have it in your written materials. But really, I guess the moral of the story is, once you receive a contractor claim, giving kind of the steps, the best way to respond to them. But for an owner to stick their head in the sand, which oftentimes is what you're apt to do, hope that that claim is going to go away. It's incumbent, especially in the day and age of COVID, that owners not stick their heads in the sand and try to manage their way through a contractor claim.
Yeah, and on the ninth topic of accurately forecasting the time of performance, again, just to reiterate, a contractor has a duty to mitigate. And so when forecasting the time to complete the project post-COVID-19, and including the impacts of COVID-19, it's important to, include any kind of mitigation efforts. And then also separating out, again, as with the costs, when it comes to the time and the schedule associated with that, clearly delineate what the COVID-19 impacts are. Break out a separate, what we call fragment, get a little bit technical here, that's specifically related to COVID-19 or reflects it in the schedule. So it's clearly demonstrated in the schedule. Hey, here's our COVID-19, here's how it's linked into the contract work scope and how it's affecting it or not affecting it. Just being transparent like that makes the negotiations and completing the project that much more manageable and actually leads to more successful outcomes.
And beyond the fragments, it's important to relook at your durations. Your durations are going to change based on less productivity. So that's revisit durations for your like the activities that are in your schedule.
And it goes back to, in terms of calculating productivity loss, right? Being able to use a method like measured mile. You need to have those benchmarks to be able to use against what's actually happening in the project. And then just tracking, documentation, document, right? You can't document enough. Just make sure your records are accurate, that they're timely, dealing with these issues in real time when the impacts are happening is much more preferred than after the fact and having to hire folks like us to come in and forensically recreate what happened. It's not the way that successful outcomes happen. It's dealing with it head on, real time, as the impacts as they're occurring.
Okay, we're reached our last topic, and this is permitting and inspection. So it's no project will start without a permit, and no project's going to complete without inspection. And the permitting side as well as the inspection side are both being impacted by protocols and regulations within COVID or driven by COVID. But you need to be aware of them. You can't just sit there and think I'm going to be able to get a permit in the normal course. You need to look at that again, because if you thought it was going to take you 2 weeks, it may take you 4 to 6. Same thing goes with inspections, whether it be regulatory or even inspections by your designer. You can't just make the call and expect that entity or that individual to be out there next day. You need to be planning for that more diligently in your schedule and have it have realistic estimates and understand what the agency is dealing with as far as their restrictions and get input from them on what it's going to take, as well as inspections. And it's going to be an impact. You need to flesh it out early so you can plan for it and manage it and mitigate it.
Well, so we've run out of time, but just want to move it. So I thank you both for this. I mean, obviously there's a lot to talk about. I've only been able to touch the beginning of it, and I thank you all for sitting through this, because I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot to consider, and we're only at the beginning of it. So hopefully it's been helpful, at least to start forecasting what the issues are going to be in this pandemic economy. And so our last poll question is going to be to all of our attendees. If you're interested and if you're would like us to expound further on any of the subject matters that have been talked about today, please hit yes, and we'll reach out to you all. But thank you, Barrett. Thank you, Charlie. I mean, this has been extremely informative, and I think hopefully we'll continue these discussions, and I'm hopeful that these best practices we talked about today are really going to help us all navigate this pandemic economy.
Appreciate the opportunity, Jeff.
Great. Thank
you
all
very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all for attending.
All right, be well.